Okay, so welcome to yet another virtual Bay Area Digital Transformation Meetup. So far, we've run a couple of sessions virtually this year that have been pretty well received. One on RPA versus DPA and one on metrics for transformation. Today, we're going to be discussing practical business process modeling techniques and how you can use them to improve the success of your digital transformation initiatives. So during the session today, we'll do some quick introductions. There'll be a short presentation to set the stage for the topic, and then we're going to have some group discussion through our webinar here. Unfortunately, since this is on the web, we won't have the same opportunities for networking, but we hope in future that we'll be able to revive these in-person sessions. So let's go ahead and start with our introductions, and I'd like to briefly hand over to our event sponsor, Tim from Axon Ivy.
Thanks, Neil. It's very exciting to be with all of you today. Thanks very much. I'm Tim Harris, Director of Sales and Business Development for Axon Ivy. And we are very close partners with Innovelocity, one of our premier US partners, and very honored and proud to be here today. Just to give you a little background on us, we've been a leading provider of business process management applications for over 25 years now. We have over 2,000 customers and established offices around the globe. And with our Axon Ivy digital business platform, our customers manage, digitize, and automate their daily business processes in a very efficient way and error-free way, much more so than ever before. So our platform, the Axon Ivy digital business platform, has been very well received by leading analysts such as Gartner and Forrester. So in a brief summary, the Axon Ivy digital business platform is used for modeling business processes across multiple departments within an organization. And it integrates with multiple legacy systems and enterprise applications with really powerful UI application builder that ties everything together. So together with our partners and customers, we build custom business applications on our platform that they span from small quick win applications to complex mission critical applications. So some of the results of the modeling techniques that Neil will show you today would be ideally suited for our platform. So that's a little bit about us, and I'll turn it back to Neil for the presentation on the modeling.
Great, yeah, thank you very much, Tim, and we appreciate your sponsorship and your partnership for these events. So just a little bit about us, Innovelocity. We're a specialist consultancy and system integrator that specializes in these cutting-edge digital transformation technologies like Axon Ivy. And we offer a full suite of services that can help you to deliver a complete solution, everything from process modeling and analysis and improvement all the way through to building the automation and designing reports. We work with companies of all sizes in a variety of different verticals, but most of the business that we get comes from the topic we're discussing today, which is digital process automation and process modeling. Now, it's a truism that business process automation, if it's applied to a broken business process, is only going to help problems to occur in vastly increased numbers and at a greater frequency. But it's one that's often forgotten in a rush to implement these new technologies to get ahead of the competition. And DPA software like Axon Ivy, as Tim mentioned, can help you automate your processes really, really quickly. They all have these same three main components where there's some kind of capability to design a process map. An analyst will define the steps, the performers, and the logic of a process. There'll be some kind of designer that's used by a developer to import that process map and use wizards to build a web application, and some kind of engine that's used to run those applications through a portal and let users interact with it. But the foundation of these, the starting point for the automation is that process model, and that's a smart move because if it's analyzed and mapped out correctly, you're more likely to realize the efficiencies and the gains that you're looking for. So what are we doing when we're process modeling? Well, of course, the primary objective is to understand the business process itself, the steps, the performers, the sequence, and make sure it's clear, agreed, and optimized. However, for automation, it's also important that it's possible to translate that business process into requirements that are actionable by a developer. And the key is to make sure that you have this common language and frame of reference between the two, between the business stakeholders and the developers, so that nothing gets lost in translation. The most widely adopted and popular standard for modeling processes is OMG's BPMN, or Business Process Modeling Notation. And we think it's a great fit for that type of scenario because it's designed to bridge the gap between business and IT by being simultaneously readable by non-technical people. It's something that you could show to a manager or a business stakeholder and they would get it. But it has enough rules and precision where you could hand it to a developer and make it be the basis of an automation project. And one of the key features of BPMN is the limited number of shapes that you use when you're creating these diagrams. If you're doing this kind of work regularly, you've probably seen all kinds of different types of workflow diagram with inconsistent use of confusing shapes. You might have one with the picture of the man carrying the box and the truck and all these kind of crazy shapes that get added. But this lack of consistency is a real killer when it comes to defining systems and optimizing processes across different organizational silos. So when we're looking at BPMN, really there's only 4 classes of shape that we're using. There's pools and lanes, which represent processes and participants. There's activities, which are things that are happening within the process, whether they're automated or human performed. There's flow, sequence flow, this follows that. Events, which cause the process to start, pause, resume, interrupt, and redirect and end. And gateways, which are routing. And that's it. There are different variations of it. And that's what we'll dig into a little bit here. Let's look at each one of these in just a little bit more detail and talk about some of the best practices that we have and that we've used in the variety of projects that we've done. And we'll start with lanes here. Again, a lane groups together everything for a participant in the process. And the first very important tip that I would give is to make sure that when you're defining this, you capture every actor that's involved in the process. If they are transforming something, if they're transporting something, or if they're just simply tying it up, if they're basically just handing it from one place to the other, you want to make sure they're represented with a lane in your diagram. When you're defining these lanes as well, generally speaking, it's going to fall into one of these 4 categories where you have a role, for example, like a student, a department, or some kind of organizational area, like let's say admissions, a job title, perhaps that would be a position, like admin assistant. We also typically model processes with a separate swim lane for each external information system that's used within the process. This is really nice because you can see grouped into a single lane all the different touch points or interactions with a particular information system, which could then be used for developing use cases, developing integrations, and so on. What you do want to avoid doing when you're putting these together is avoid using individual names or users. There was one project that we worked on some time ago where the chief operations officer wanted to have his own swim lane, but that very clearly illustrated a key bottleneck in the process. So we tried to turn that into a role where there'd be multiple people that could be involved. We also recommend avoiding the use of acronyms if possible. Even within an organization, sometimes people have differing understanding of acronyms, and it's always better to actually spell out precisely what it is that the acronym is representing. When it comes to activities, again, these are showing what work is being done. You have tasks, which could be turning into a form for a user in your information system where they're interacting, entering information, reading information, all the create, read, update, delete type of operations. It could also be work that's done offline. We call this a manual task, but we think it's very important to show these in your diagram as well to get a complete picture of what's happening. It could be a call to an external system to read or write data. We call those service tasks. Or it could be executing an action, something like sending an email or running a calculation or checking a rule. We would call that a script task. In addition to regular tasks, you can also group things together into a sub-process if they're logically something that can be grouped together. Sometimes this is done to create a higher level picture that's very simple and easy to read, just some of the main major milestones that you could then open up and see the details inside. And sometimes it's used if you have this behavior where there's repetition or looping, where maybe a certain condition, the same thing happens over and over until a condition's met or a certain number of times, or if something needs to be done in parallel or sequentially, instead of mapping the same steps over and over and over again, you would put them into a sub-process, which could then have a loop condition or could be shown multiple times on your same diagram. When it comes to naming an activity, this is actually more important than you may think as well. The name represents a lot because it checks you're thinking about what's happening inside of each box. Think of each activity as its own process or a system. It's got to have some kind of triggering event, some action or decision or temporal event that makes it happen. It's got to have some steps or decisions or work that's happening, and it has to produce some kind of product, service, or information, some output for the next step. So the trick that I like to use to make sure that we're following this thought process when we're naming an activity is to use an action, verb, and a noun. So you'll see here in the bottom left an example of this not being done properly, where you have words like service order management or installation process. And words like management or process are usually a red flag because the output's not clear. You can't define requirements for that or measure it. So some of the better examples here on the right would be something like capture a service order or assign the network facilities or install equipment. It suddenly becomes a little bit clearer what the subject of the activity is, what can be measured, what's being done. Another thing to watch out for is if you have a series of activities for the same performer all after one another, like in this top example, you might be defining a procedure and not an activity. You might want to consider having a checklist or a desk level procedure that can be linked to the step. So you just have, for example, one activity that says perform customer setup, and then there's a checklist that tells them what to look up and what to enter and what to do instead. Another very important tip that we like to use when we're creating these diagrams is to basically have a very clear left to right readable flow. It's very important that the precedence and the timing is clear in your diagram. Who's waiting for who? Does it bounce back and forth and so on? So we like to set things up where outputs always come out of the right of the box and come in to the left of the next box, always moving from left to right and putting activities in the same vertical space only if they're happening in parallel. So you can see here a good example of this going from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, as opposed to here you can see step 1 coming down to step 2 vertically, even though they're not happening in parallel. And we see a lot of people trying to do this to try and make things fit onto a page. But honestly, I'd have to ask you all, how many of you actually print these things anymore? I think more often than not, you're going to be able to scroll left to right, and it's much clearer if you lay it out this way. You can see better the dependency and the timing, which is great for identifying redundant handoff problems where things are yo-yoing back and forth, for example, or where things could be done in parallel, but maybe you're not. You really want to avoid those diagrams that are a bit like chutes and ladders or spaghetti and are just plain hard to read because you're trying to fit everything all into one page. Now, events can sometimes be a point of confusion for folks because it does get a bit more technical here, but the most important thing to remember is that there's basically ways to start, stop, or interrupt a process. This is the start, intermediate, and end events. And then the different types here along the top, you have messages, which are things coming from other processes or systems. A timer would be some kind of delay or time-based trigger. Empty events are basically a blank slate to let you define something that doesn't fit into this pattern. And then there are errors. This is a great example of BPMN being helpful for systems development because it lets the business folks define and express what should happen in the process if there's some kind of problem. Should it escalate somewhere? Should it follow a different path? Should it stop? These are the kind of things that oftentimes get lost when you're trying to design a workflow diagram without using standards like this. Now, gateways, many of you will be familiar with these. These control the flow of the process. And there are a few more types in BPMN, but these three most important ones are exclusive gateways, which basically say you can go this way or that, one way or the other. And there's typically a default path that's defined with a dashed line that can be followed in ambiguous circumstances. There's a parallel gateway, you can see here with this plus, which allows simultaneous execution, two things to happen at once. And then there's something called an inclusive gateway, which is kind of like a mix between the two. It allows you to have one or more paths to be taken at the same time based on conditions. And you would still have this idea of a default line, which can be followed if no conditions are met. And that's another nice thing about BPMN, is this idea of default paths. Again, when you're a system designer, you always need some way for the system to behave if something unexpected comes up, if one of the pre-existing pathways that you thought through for whatever reason isn't an option. Another important thing to keep in mind about gateways is merging, because this does create some interesting different behaviors depending on how you set it up. So I've got two examples here on the screen, one with a merge and one without, to show how they behave completely differently. With this top one here, you can see we have two tasks happening in parallel to start with. Do this one and then do this one. After you complete this task up here, it moves on to the next one. This merge here is basically like a stop sign that's saying to wait until both of these pathways have finished doing what they're doing before the process ends. If we had not put that merge in place, what would happen would be a race basically between these two different pathways. So in other words, if these two got finished before this one did, it would go right to the end of the process and stop potentially, which generally is not desirable. Sometimes it is, and you would want to deliberately do that, but more often than not, when you're breaking something off in parallel, you're expecting to wait until all the other parallel steps are completed before you move on. So kind of tying it together here, a very simple example, you can see we have start and end events for different spots where the process can end. You'll also see that there is exclusive gateways here for approval decisions and for questions that are captured within your process. And there's a merge and different activities. You'll also notice that in this little example here, we've numbered each step, which is very useful for tying documentation, such as user stories or requirements or policies and procedures, typically a number for your process and a number for each step. Now, there are some very cool tools out there that let you create interactive models and link all this documentation together and put it in a portal, have change control and so on. And I'd be happy to give references for some of those at the end of the discussion here. But at the very least, you could even do all of this with Visio and publish it yourselves. There are BPMN templates out there that let you do it as well. Now, we could do a whole series of meetings about lean analysis, Six Sigma, and various measurement and improvement methodologies. And these are all great and very compatible with modeling with BPMN. But at the most basic level, if you're designing these processes in a workshop setting, there are a few basic questions that you can ask and visual assessments that you can make that will immediately identify potential improvements. So just looking at the workflow, we'd mentioned this idea of the precedence and the timing. If you've laid it out correctly, you're going to immediately see if there are situations where there are yo-yos, unnecessary handoffs going back and forth between participants. And you're also going to be able to see if there are activities that could be done in parallel because there are no other dependencies on them. You can also, as you're going through and reviewing each step, just ask some simple basic questions. Is it necessary? Does it still yield a useful result? Is the most appropriate performer handling it based on the swim lane that you set up? Is all the necessary information available to the performer to do their task? Is there something that we can do to change that situation? And do handoffs create potential for error or delay? Anytime when you're handing off from one box to another, even with a BPM like Axe and Ivy, there's always a potential for additional delay while someone's waiting to pick up and perform their task or do their work. And last thing I'll say about this is that, of course, this should all happen within a structured delivery framework that's establishing the right metrics, picking the right candidates, assigning process owners, and so on. And this is something we'd be happy to chat more with you about at another time. However, the most common best practice when it comes just to modeling, which is today's discussion, is to map and understand your as-is process first, identify the desired improvements from some kind of baseline, and then design alternative processes with those improvements in mind for acceptance with your stakeholders before going in and designing a system. So with that said, just a short kind of setup presentation with some of the basics of modeling with BPMN and some best practices that we have. One of the values of the meetup is to have the open discussion, hear what you have to say, your own thoughts, your own practical tips, and so on. So some example discussion topics that we have here would be, other practical tips that you would have, any challenges that you might have encountered, how it could apply to your projects, maybe some questions that you have about what you've seen. And if you don't mind, we have a chat feature here that you can use to drop that in. Please do so. And then Tim has kindly agreed to kind of tee these up for discussion here. So Tim, let's see, do we have anything coming through yet?
Yeah. Is your presentation soft? A question from Ermel. Is your presentation soft copy available?
Yep, absolutely. We'll distribute a soft copy of this presentation. We're also going to have a recording published if you want to follow along that way. I would be remiss if I didn't have a plug and just say that this is kind of a very basic surface look at BPMN and best practices, and we do offer full training classes that really get into optimizing process design for implementation in a BPM.
Terrific. Thanks, Neil. A question from Sammy. Where can I get more training on BPMN?
Okay, well, yeah, that one, of course, we will offer our own training class, so please do feel free to reach out to us, Neil at InnoVelocity, or info at InnoVelocity, and we can actually discuss the types of training that we have available and see if there's a good match for your needs. The other thing I'll mention is that this BPMN standard, it's not something that we invented, it's not something that Axe and Ivy invented. It's very much an open standard. It's maintained by OMG. And if you go to bpmn.org, they have a ton of information there as well, if you kind of prefer to read up on your own.
Next question. Thanks, Neil. Next question from Sue. Do all DPA platforms support BPMN? I can speak specifically for Axe and Ivy. I don't know if all do, but I know that Axe and Ivy does. Right, Neil?
Yep. Yeah, no, that's one of the reasons we like Axe and Ivy, of course, is it uses the standard. There are a number of tools. I'd say the majority of tools now do support BPMN, but not all. We actually work with a number of platforms, so we understand the pros and cons of each one, and some of them use their own proprietary modeling notation, and it's just something to keep in mind when you're deciding what platform to use or what platform to select. But yeah, it is probably the most widely adopted.
In our case, we're supporting BPMN full standard, but also extensions, so you're able to build on top of it too, which is, at least for our platform, we consider that to be an advantage. Terrific. Thanks. The last question from Ravi. Oh, a couple more questions. Another question from Irmo, but a question from Ravi. What challenges are there to getting people to adopt BPMN?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So one is definitely the knowledge gap. So I think most people are familiar with reading workflow diagrams at this point in a business context. Lots of people know what a swim lane is, and they understand the boxes and the diamonds, and that makes intuitive sense. But there can sometimes be some resistance to, I don't want to use the word handcuffs, but BPMN is deliberately restrictive because it's very rules-based so that you can use it to drive a system implementation. So people need to be made aware of why those rules exist and go through a very basic orientation, even something like this, the kind of level of information we shared today, to help people understand why it is the way that it is and the benefits and the best practices of it. Beyond that, the other thing which is typically required, especially in a larger enterprise organization, if you have lots of competing standards, is to try and establish some kind of program office or PMO or center of excellence. There's lots of words for it, but some standard setting body that can actually drive adoption through the organization and define tools and templates that people can use.
Thanks, Neil. Last question from Ermil. It's actually two questions. I think they're related. About he wants interested in an example of end-to-end how BPMN has added value. He's looking for an example that you can share.
Now that's a good question too. I think we have some documentation that we can share, maybe along with the presentation case studies that really illustrates this. But if you're talking about end-to-end, usually what you're talking about is looking at almost like an enterprise level view, a value chain level view of a whole organization or a business unit, and then drilling down in successive levels of detail to identify improvement opportunities, to really understand the context of the process that you're changing and the impacts on other processes that might depend on it. So, again, you're getting back to your program office scenario where you're having someone understand that organizational architecture and putting that high level framework in place so that you have a framework to build around. I think that's very, very important to do something that's truly end to end. But we did actually do something recently at a biotechnology company here in Silicon Valley that they're very new, they're in startup mode, very rapid growth. But because they were a startup with very rapid growth, they didn't really have much of their business process, policy, and procedure written down anywhere. And in order to get a product into market, they had to get ISO and MDSAP certification. And anyone who's been through an ISO audit knows you need tons of documentation about your process, and you need people to be able to prove that they understand and they're following that process. So we went through basically a methodology where we identified the high-level process groups with business sponsors, and then for practically every operational process in that company, we documented the next level down business process. And attached to each step in that business process, if you remember, you saw the difference between an activity and a procedure. We had desk level procedures that we had written up that would go for each one of those steps. And we put it all in an interactive portal where any worker, when the auditor comes around, can just click down to their process and their step in the process and pull up the procedure and say, this is my procedure and how I'm following it.
Great, Neil. That's it for questions. I think it's a wrap on the questions. So.
Okay, very good. Well, definitely appreciate the engagement and the questions here. This is all excellent stuff. We appreciate you also joining us here this evening. So again, we'll publish out the slides and the recording through the meetup group so that you can access it. It'll have our contact information on it. If you have any questions about anything you've seen here today, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're more than happy to talk. We love talking about this stuff.
And thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate it, your time on a Wednesday evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.